Caimans are a type of crocodilian native to the Americas and closely related to alligators. They consist of 6 extant species who have a variety of diets. The black caiman is a large predator similar to alligators. The broad-snouted caiman focuses on prey with hard shells, while the small, smooth-fronted caiman hunts primarily on land. Millions of years ago, caimans were even more diverse. One of the most unusual was Mourasuchus, who had a massive, broad skull. Despite its size, its giant skull was not built for power like those of its relatives. Instead, Mourasuchus focused on smaller animals, with some proposals going as far as to suggest it was a filter feeder, serving as the crocodilian equivalent to baleen whales. However, debate continues on how this remarkable caiman lived. Mourasuchus is a genus which consisted of multiple species. They are Mourasuchus atopus, Mourasuchus orensi, Mourasuchus pattersoni, and the type species Mourasuchus amazonensis. They lived in South America between 16 to 7 million years ago, during the Miocene epoch. While they were not all contemporaries, Mourasuchus orensi coexisted with both Mourasuchus pattersoni and Mourasuchus amazonensis. Mourasuchus skulls are often a meter long, and it was previously held to be one of the largest crocodilians of all time. Estimates for the largest species, Mourasuchus amazonensis, came to 10 to 12 meters long. This was an overestimation, which was partly due to the inclusion of juvenile crocodilians in the datasets. Younger crocodilians are both far less dangerous and physically easier to work with than adults, but also have different proportions. In the most recent study, the upper estimates of Mourasuchus amazonensis' size came to a weight of roughly 1 ton and a length between 5 to 6 meters. The upper estimate, while far from that of a megacroc, is still larger than even the most exceptional saltwater crocodiles, the largest living reptiles. Mourasuchus pattersoni was slightly smaller than Mourasuchus amazonensis, while Mourasuchus orensi weighed roughly half as much. The smallest species by far was Mourasuchus atopus. It was no more than 3 meters long and weighed between 120 and 136 kilograms. This is about as long as a large Yakare caiman, but more than twice as heavy. These are only rough estimates, and the results may themselves have been biased by the fact that most modern caimans are small by crocodilian standards. In contrast, one of Mourasuchus's closest relatives was the extinct megacroc Mourasuchus. In crocodilian evolution, Mourasuchus is something of an anomaly, and not just because its head looked weird. The different shapes of most crocodilian skulls are the result of them evolving different balances between the power of their bites and the speed with which they can strike. Species with broad, powerful skulls like the American alligator focus on large animals, but their skulls are not very hydrodynamic. Crocodilians with thin skulls, like the African slender-snouted crocodiles, hunt smaller, quicker fish, but their skulls cannot handle the stresses created by struggling megafauna. Sitting between the two extremes are generalists like the American crocodile. However, despite the broad shape of its skull, Mourasuchus was unable to successfully attack large animals. Its skull bones, and especially its mandible, were much thinner than normal. Combined with its longer length, this would have heavily reduced the power of Mourasuchus's bite and compromised its ability to safely hold upon large, struggling animals. Instead of creating a more powerful bite, its broad skull seems to evolve to maximize its surface area. Mourasuchus's numerous teeth interlocked with each other. Most of them were smaller than those of other crocodilians. The first 4 teeth in its skull were the exception, yet even these were proportionally tiny compared to its massive skull. The majority of these teeth were conical, like the teeth of other crocodilians, although the teeth at the back of Mourasuchus's jaws were laterally compressed. While Mourasuchus was unusual among its relatives, it was not the only one to evolve along this path. Similar skulls, and presumably diets, evolved in the clades Stomatosuchidae and Egyptosuchidae, both of whom lived in what is now North Africa during the early Cretaceous period. The largest of these, Stomatosuchus, had a skull over 2 meters long and is estimated to have had a body length of 10 meters. Neither clade was closely related to Mourasuchus, and there were technically not even true crocodilians, but closely related crocodilomorphs. Both Mourasuchus and its Mesozoic lookalikes are thought to have possibly had a gular sac similar to that of a pelican. This would have aided in the capture of small, slow-moving prey. However, due to a lack of fossil evidence, the existence of a gular sac remains speculation. Although not its most famous trait, the squamosal bones in Mourasuchus's skull were large and elevated, forming a pair of structures called squamosal horns. Similar horns are present in some modern crocodilians and are thought to serve a role in attracting mates. While squamosal horns are absent in modern caimans, they were present and quite prominent in the caiman Acrosuchus, a contemporary of Mourasuchus atopus. While the rest of Mourasuchus's body may seem more mundane, it was also unusual compared to other crocodilians. For instance, despite Mourasuchus's large head, its neck vertebrae were shorter and weaker than other crocodilians. This meant it would have likely been incapable of performing the death roll utilized by other crocodilians. Death rolling is vital when crocodilians try to tear large food items into pieces small enough to swallow. Mourasuchus would also have been tied to the water more than any other caiman. Its humerus was both long and slender, which mirrors the condition of those crocodilians like the gharial, which struggle to move out of the water. Terrestrial locomotion would have been particularly difficult for the largest species of Mourasuchus, Mourasuchus amazonensis. Despite this, Mourasuchus was not a great swimmer either, at least by crocodilian standards, since the shape of its skull was not hydrodynamic. Likewise, some reconstructions have come to the same conclusion for the rest of its body. However, the lack of a complete Mourasuchus skeleton means that these reconstructions and the conclusions derived from them are tentative. Fortunately for Mourasuchus, given where its fossils have been found, it seems to have inhabited environments with calm, slow-moving water, like lakes and swamps. With all this in mind, it is apparent that Mourasuchus lived in a very different manner than today's caimans. This still leaves the question of just what it was eating and how it caught it. With its delicate jaws, it is clear Mourasuchus was restricted to small prey, perhaps fish, crabs, shrimp, gastropods, or bivalves. Additionally, while the proposals of Mourasuchus's diet are varied, they all agree that its skull evolved its odd shape so as to maximize its surface area. One possible strategy is that Mourasuchus held its mouth open in the water. Then, when unwary fish entered, it quickly closed its jaws, trapping the fish inside. This behavior has been observed in modern caimans, and with its wider skull and tightly interlocking teeth, Mourasuchus would have been even better at it. If it truly specialized in this strategy, then Mourasuchus would have been the reptilian equivalent of a Venus flytrap. It has been questioned if enough fish would have entered Mourasuchus's mouth for it to have been able to rely on this sit-and-wait strategy. However, the modern alligator snapping turtle hunts by similar means, and rather than rely on chance, uses its worm-like tongue to attract victims. The most famous hypothesis for how Mourasuchus caught its food is that it was a filter feeder. Under this proposed mode of existence, Mourasuchus slowly swam through the water with its mouth held open. As it moved through the water, it swallowed small creatures such as fish, which it collected in its gullar sac. If true, then this unusual caiman lived more like a whale than a crocodile. One of the problems with this hypothesis is that there is no evidence that Mourasuchus had an effective way to actually filter its food from other inedible material that entered its mouth. Of course, if Mourasuchus did have structures similar to the baleen of whales, then their existence wouldn't necessarily be recorded in the extant fossils. At the very least, it could have pushed most of the water out of its mouth while using its interlocking teeth to keep large food inside. Another hypothesis is that Mourasuchus was durophagous, feeding upon bivalves and other hard-shelled invertebrates. Such prey was abundant in Mourasuchus's range. Prehistoric South America was home to numerous durophagous caimans, at least 3 of which were contemporaries of Mourasuchus. Like them, Mourasuchus's wide snout would have allowed it to dig through the mud in search of unlucky mollusks. Another, much older crocodilomorph with an unusually broad snout was Anatosuchus, nicknamed the duck croc. It is also thought to have used its snout to dig through the mud. However, it hunted in shallow water and isn't thought to have been durophagous. A major difference between Mourasuchus and durophagous caimans is that its thin teeth and weak bite were almost uniquely unsuited for crushing hard shells. Instead, it has been proposed that Mourasuchus gulped large amounts of bivalves whole. Since crocodilians have strong stomachs, it may have still been able to digest them. This would explain why its snout was so much longer than its competition, since Mourasuchus would have been trying to maximize the number of mollusks captured at a time. Much like the filter feeding hypothesis, it has been proposed that Mourasuchus could have collected them in a gullar sac before it swallowed. This strategy has usually been referred to as gulp feeding. Still, by digging through the mud, even more non-edible material would have been mixed with its food than in the more traditional filter feeding hypothesis. Therefore, Mourasuchus would have still had a strong incentive to evolve a way to separate its food from the mud and rocks. Mourasuchus has even been considered to have been a possible herbivore, feeding on aquatic plants or algae. This is less outlandish than it sounds. Modern caiman supplement their meat-heavy diets with fruit. Additionally, a Mesozoic relative of crocodilians, Mourasuchus, was a dedicated herbivore, as were some other more distantly related terrestrial crocodilomorphs like Mourasuchus. Still, no traits connected to herbivory have been identified in Mourasuchus. On the other hand, if the gulp feeding hypothesis is true, then it likely regularly ingested plant matter along with its intended prey. While all 4 species of Mourasuchus have been treated as a monolithic entity here, Mourasuchus orensi lived alongside other species of Mourasuchus. To avoid competition, the diets and lifestyles of these sympatric species would have had to differ from each other in some respects. When Mourasuchus was alive, South America possessed even more freshwater habitat than today. Combined with its high temperature and humidity, this led to the evolution of one of the most diverse crocodilian faunas the world has ever seen. An example of this was the Mourasuchus Formation, which was inhabited by both Mourasuchus orensi and Mourasuchus pattersoni. Besides durophagous caimans like Globodentosuchus, it was home to the ancestors of many of today's other caimans and the still extant broad-snouted caiman, Caiman laterostris. The Mourasuchus Formation was also the dominion of the gigantic Mourasuchus, easily the deadliest predator Mourasuchus had to contend with. Caimans are not the only crocodilians found in the Mourasuchus Formation. It was also inhabited by gavialids, who are long-snouted fish-eating specialists. The largest of these, Gryposuchus, grew 10 meters long. Additionally, there were relatives of today's crocodiles, such as Caractosuchus. However, unlike modern South America's crocodiles who are either generalists or large prey specialists, these species were long-snouted fish-eaters like the gavialids. This freshwater paradise came to an end about 5 million years ago at the close of the Miocene. There was a decrease in the formerly abundant freshwater environments in South America, and with less habitat available, specialized forms like Mourasuchus became extinct. While not as fearsome as its cousin Mourasuchus or even the modern black caiman, Mourasuchus was easily the strangest caiman to ever evolve. This is true regardless of whether it was a gulp feeder or a crocodilian take on a manatee, whale, or a Venus flytrap. With its diet, size, and so many other questions about it still up in the air, it's clear a lot remains to be learned about the unusual Mourasuchus.
Thank you for watching, and a thank you to themattalorian for narrating this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to hit the like button, and subscribe if you'd like to see more.